One of the most disturbing things about the case is that he was dating his second victim's mother at the time of her murder. He comforted her and encouraged her to get grief counseling to help her process her daughter's death, knowing the whole time that he himself was the one responsible. The night was warm in Las Vegas, the kind of desert air that carried a stillness even in the middle of summer. 28-year-old Keysha Brown was a woman full of life, funny, hard-working, and fiercely protective of the people she loved. Friends said she had a laugh that could carry across a room, the kind of laugh that pulled you in and made you feel like you belonged. But behind that warmth was also resilience. Keysha worked hard to support herself, balancing shifts and family responsibilities, trying to carve out her piece of the American dream. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't come from privilege. But she carried with her the hope of something better, the hope of building a future that reflected her energy, her loyalty, and her love for her family. That night, though, something unimaginable happened. Keysha never made it home. The killing of Brown took place in Las Vegas on October 18, 2004, in the 700 block of East Flamingo Road, police stated. At the time of the slaying, several people had called 911 to report they had found the body of Keysha Brown at an apartment complex, according to police. The Clark County Coroner's Office determined her cause of death was strangulation/homicide. During the autopsy, it was also determined she had been raped, stabbed, beaten, and killed by strangulation. The brutality of it was staggering. The kind of violence that makes the heart stop and the mind reel. Who could do something like this, and why her? For her family, the loss was more than tragic, it was crushing. Her mother, who had always believed her daughter's laughter would echo into old age, now sat in silence, broken by the sudden void. And for the Las Vegas police, the case would become one of the darkest puzzles they'd ever face. At first, there were no clear answers. The crime scene was horrific, but the evidence was messy, tangled, and incomplete. Whoever had done this seemed to vanish into the night. No witnesses, no obvious suspects. And yet, Keysha's story didn't end there. Because tucked inside her body was the killer's mistake. DNA. A silent witness waiting. During interviews, detectives stated that Brown's boyfriend had found her inside her apartment bathtub, and it was determined that someone had covered her up. Witnesses stated that the suspect arrived at the complex in a red sedan, entered Brown's apartment, and later came out carrying a duffel bag. No one was able to identify the suspect at the time, police said. DNA finally spoke, after 20 years. And when it did, it would point directly to a man whose name was already tied to other horrors. In August of 2022, during a cold case review, an investigator recognized a pattern related to another murder investigation in 2005, police said. Based on that information, police said they were able to conduct additional testing on evidence in the Brown case, and they discovered a serial predator hiding in plain sight. And Keysha's case would prove not only his brutality, but his pattern, a pattern that stretched across the lives of other women. But before that truth came to light, there was the waiting, the questions, the nights Keysha's family cried out for answers that never seemed to come. For nearly 2 decades, her story was a wound left open. Until one day, the past knocked on the present, and everything changed. When the world talks about monsters, it often imagines something out of a storybook. Sharp teeth with red-looking eyes, something you'd never mistake for human. But real monsters, they look like us. They walk the same street. They buy coffee at the same corner store. They nod politely when they pass you in the hallway. And in 2004, one of those monsters lived in Las Vegas. His name was Norman Flowers. To most people, he wasn't anyone special. He wasn't famous. He wasn't important. He was just another face in the crowd. But to women like Keysha Brown, Sheila Quarles, Marilee Coote, and Rena Gonzales, he was death itself. Flowers carried with him a violence that was cold, calculated, and merciless. He didn't stumble into his crimes. He hunted. He chose. He stalked. And when the moment was right, he unleashed terror. Keysha was not his only victim. She was the beginning of a storm. In 2005, the year after Keysha's brutal murder, more women in Las Vegas would cross paths with this predator. Sheila Quarles, Marilee Coote, Rena Gonzales. Each of them lived their own lives, carried their own dreams, and yet, all of them would meet the same fate at his hands. And yet in those early years, no one truly saw him for what he was. He blended in, hidden behind ordinary life. But his cruelty always left scars, on bodies, on families, on entire communities. By the time investigators realized the full scope of his violence, 3 more women were gone. It was as though he moved in silence, a shadow slipping from crime scene to crime scene, leaving nothing but devastation in his wake. The horror of it all? For nearly 2 decades, Keysha's case remained unsolved. Her family lived with silence. Her mother lit candles. Her siblings whispered prayers. But the system had no answers. The evidence sat locked away. And Norman Flowers carried on. But DNA doesn't forget. It doesn't lie. It doesn't disappear. In 2024, 20 years after Keysha was stolen from the world, the science finally caught up with him. The results were undeniable. His genetic fingerprint tied him directly to the crime that shattered her family. It was him. It had always been him. And when that truth surfaced, the families of all his victims learned what they had long suspected. Norman Flowers was not just a killer. He was a serial killer. A man whose name would forever be written in blood. To understand the weight of Keysha's story, you need to hear it through the voice of someone who carried her in her arms, someone who taught her to walk, someone who sat at the kitchen table with her late at night, laughing about little things that only family laughs about. That voice belongs to Keysha's mother. In every crime, when the headlines fade and the cameras move on, it's the family who keeps living with the silence. And for 20 years, Keysha's mother carried that silence like a stone pressed against her chest. She remembers her daughter not as a victim, not as a name in a courtroom file, but as a girl who loved music, who laughed loudly, who cared deeply. She remembers Keysha's ambition, her plans for the future. And she remembers the last time she spoke to her. It was just hours before everything changed. Keysha had called her that evening, just to check in. Her mother recalled that she sounded cheerful, busy, full of the ordinary energy of a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. But then her mother said something chilling years later, something that stuck with detectives once the case reopened. She told me she thought someone was watching her. It wasn't a long comment. Just a fleeting note, almost brushed aside at the time. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe just a bad feeling. But when the family remembered it, when it resurfaced during the investigation decades later, it sent a shiver down the room, because it lined up with Flowers' pattern. His victims were not chosen randomly. He stalked. He watched. He studied. And so, for Keysha's mother, that tiny sliver of conversation became a haunting echo. For years she asked herself, was she already being followed? Did she already sense the shadow closing in? In the courtroom years later, when DNA evidence finally named Norman Flowers, her mother sat in the gallery, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't just hearing about science or technology. She was hearing validation. She was hearing that her daughter's instincts, that chilling last phone call, had been right. All along, Keysha had felt him there. And for her mother, the fight wasn't just for justice. It was to make sure the world never forgets her daughter's life, her laughter, her plans, and her warning. For nearly 2 decades, Keysha Brown's murder sat in a folder marked unsolved. Her family would call. Detectives would revisit the file. Leads came and went, whispers faded, suspects disappeared into dead ends. But in the quiet hallways of law enforcement, time doesn't always mean defeat. Sometimes time becomes a weapon, and in this case, time brought DNA technology. The silent evidence crept into daylight. Back in 2004, when Keysha's body was found, police collected evidence as they always did. Swabs, fibers, fingerprints. But forensic science wasn't where it is today. Back then, DNA wasn't as sharp a tool. It was more like a blurry photograph than a high-resolution portrait. They had traces, they had samples, but they couldn't make them speak. So those samples sat, preserved, waiting. And here's the chilling part. While those tiny pieces of Keysha's last moments were sealed away in a lab freezer, the man who had destroyed her life, Norman Flowers, was still out there. Still walking the streets. Still hunting. Still killing, seeing himself as a monster who thought he'd won. You know, Norman Flowers was not a one-time killer. He was a predator. He killed Sheila Quarles. He killed Marilee Coote. He killed Rena Gonzales. He didn't just take lives. He desecrated them. Beaten. Raped. Strangled. His brutality was almost ritualistic, like he needed control, dominance, and the final power of deciding when a woman took her last breath. And the worst part? He thought he was untouchable. For years, he moved like a shadow in Las Vegas. People whispered his name, women feared him, but he stayed just outside the law's reach. No one could tie him, not yet. But the very arrogance that made him feel invincible was the same arrogance that would destroy him. In the early 2000s, Nevada authorities started building a better DNA database. As violent crimes escalated, states began connecting labs, linking cold cases with modern forensic tools. Then came the breakthrough. Samples from one of Flowers' later crimes matched his genetic fingerprint. And that's when detectives in Keysha Brown's case were notified. The sample from her body, the one sitting in evidence since 2004, was tested again with updated technology. And this time, it lit up like a beacon. The results were undeniable. DNA from Keysha's crime scene matched the same man responsible for a trail of other murders. That man was Norman Flowers. When police confronted the evidence, they knew what it meant. They weren't just dealing with a murderer. They were dealing with a serial killer who had slipped through their hands for years. Detectives began retracing Flowers' movements. They dug through old files, pulled up arrest records, interviewed people who'd known him. And what surfaced was chilling. Flowers had a long history of violence against women. He wasn't just a killer in 2004. He had been dangerous for years, a predator hidden in plain sight. Even his own pattern of behavior told the story. He stalked his victims. He manipulated them. He used brute force when charm didn't work. And he always left them silenced. The picture was clear. Keysha Brown hadn't been his first. And tragically, she hadn't been his last. For Keysha's family, the DNA match was a double-edged sword. On one hand, there was relief. Finally, after 2 decades, they had a name, a face, a person to blame. But on the other hand, the knowledge was crushing. Because while they had waited for answers, while they had lit candles and prayed for justice, Norman Flowers had kept killing. Every headline of another murdered woman was another reminder of what they'd lost, and another wound on top of the old one. And Keysha's mother? She said something unforgettable when police told her the DNA results. Now I know the face that was behind her eyes that night. Now I know the evil that took her. By 2008, with multiple cases linked to Flowers through DNA, police had enough to move in. What followed was a careful strategy. Detectives wanted not just to charge him, but to make it airtight. They knew he was slippery, manipulative, capable of violence even behind bars. So they gathered everything. Witness testimony. Patterns of behavior. Forensic analysis from each victim. Piece by piece, like building a puzzle, they constructed a portrait of a predator who had thought he was smarter than everyone else. And then, in a dramatic moment, police finally told him, "We have your DNA. We know it was you." Flowers reportedly showed little emotion. Almost like he believed he could still talk his way out of it. But the science was undeniable. The arrogance that fueled him could not erase the truth coded into his cells. The monster had finally been cornered. When Norman Flowers finally walked into the courtroom, the air shifted. He wasn't a shadow anymore. He wasn't a faceless predator hidden in alleyways and whispers. He was there, in plain sight, his body heavy in the chair, his face blank, his eyes darting but never settling. For the families of his victims, it was the first time they could look at him without fear. And yet, that didn't make it easier. Because staring at the man who destroyed your daughter's life, that's a wound that never closes. From the very beginning, prosecutors knew their strategy: make the jury feel the weight of every life lost. They didn't just present science, though the DNA evidence was their linchpin. They painted a picture of who Flowers really was: his violent history, his manipulation, his pattern of preying on vulnerable women. Piece by piece, they told the jury about Keysha Brown, about Sheila Quarles, about Marilee Coote, about Rena Gonzales. On March 24, 2005, Sheila Quarles, 18, was found by her mother, Deborah Quarles, in the bathtub of their apartment on Pecos Road in Las Vegas, Nevada. The medical examiner stated she had drowned, but there was DNA evidence that showed sexual assault and strangulation. Her autopsy showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, petechiae in her eyes, bruising around her neck consistent with manual strangulation, and vaginal tears, lacerations, and seminal fluid. Her lungs contained fluids consistent with drowning. Deborah's ex-boyfriend, Norman Flowers, had expressed his sympathy and had driven Deborah to 2 counseling appointments because he had said that he wanted to support her in her dark times. On May 3, 2005, Marilee Coote, 45, was discovered in her apartment on Russell Road, Las Vegas, Nevada. She had been raped and strangled. She also had burns on her thighs and her pubic hair had been singed. The medical examiner discovered seminal DNA from her vagina and anus, which matched DNA from the carpet in her living room. Within 8 hours, 911 emergency dispatch received a telephone call from a 9-year-old boy that reported that he had just found his friend's mother unconscious. When police arrived at the scene at the Silver Pines Apartments on Eastern Avenue in Las Vegas, the same apartment complex where Marilee Coote had been discovered just hours earlier, police found the body of Rena Gonzales, who had been strangled with a telephone cord. Her clothes were askew. The medical examiner determined that she also had injuries to her genital area. Each name was spoken slowly, each story told with deliberate pacing. And then they brought out the DNA match. The cold, undeniable fingerprint of science. Jurors leaned forward. The courtroom went silent as slides lit up on a projector. Side-by-side matches, glowing strands of genetic code tying Flowers to crime scenes years apart. It wasn't just evidence. It was truth carved in blood. One of the most powerful moments came when the victims' families took the stand. Keysha's mother, her voice shaking but steady, told the jury about her daughter's last day. About the dream she had, the person she was, the light she carried into every room. And then she looked directly at Norman Flowers. "You thought you took her voice," she said. "But today, she speaks through me." Jurors shifted in their seat. Even the defense table grew tense. Because in that moment, science met soul. DNA proved what happened. But love, raw, grieving, defiant love, proved why it mattered. Flowers' defense team tried to counter. They claimed the DNA could have been mishandled. They suggested he was being targeted because of his past. They even tried to hint at consensual encounters. But the jury didn't buy it. Not when they saw the pattern. Not when they heard about the brutality. Not when they looked at Flowers, who sat cold and expressionless, as if the lives taken meant nothing. Every time the defense tried to cast doubt, prosecutors came back with harder evidence, with more voices, with stronger testimony. Every swing Flowers team made was met with a crushing counter. For the jurors, the weight was unbearable. They weren't just deciding the fate of one man. They were carrying the voices of 4 murdered women. And then came the moment of suspense, the deliberations. The jury filed out. Hours passed. Families clutched one another in the gallery, whispering prayers. Prosecutors paced. The defense fidgeted. Would Flowers finally pay? Or would he slip away again like he had for years? Then, after hours that felt like days, the doors opened. The jury was back. The verdict: guilty. The word echoed like a gunshot. One by one, the charges were read. Guilty. 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 Keysha's mother broke into tears. Sheila Quarles' family embraced. Marilee Coote's relatives sobbed openly. Rena Gonzales' loved ones whispered, finally. And Norman Flowers? He showed no remorse. No tears. No apology. He just sat there like a man carved from stone. But the silence in his face didn't matter anymore. Because the verdict was louder than any words he could ever say. When the judge handed down his sentence, death for the murder of Keysha Brown and life without parole for the others, the courtroom held its breath. Justice had spoken. But even in victory there was reflection. Because no sentence could bring those women back. No gavel could erase the years of pain their families endured. Still, for the first time in decades, there was a sense of closure. The monster had been unmasked, tried, and caged. The trial was over. The verdict delivered. The monster who had haunted Las Vegas streets, who had stolen daughters, mothers, and friends, was finally caged. But in the quiet after the storm, something deeper remained. Because trials may end, headlines may fade, but for the families left behind, the grief never disappears. Keysha's mother stood outside the courthouse, clutching a framed photo of her daughter. Starting at the smile, and that picture was radiant, like the sun captured in human form. "I can finally breathe again," she whispered. But even as she said it, tears slipped down her cheeks. Because breathing isn't the same as healing. And justice, though powerful, is never enough to fill the empty chair at the table. For Sheila Quarles' loved ones, it was a strange mix of relief and rage. Relief that the man responsible could never harm anyone again. Rage that it had taken so long. Marilee Coote's family spoke of her laughter, how it once filled their home. They admitted that even after all these years, silence sometimes felt unbearable. And Rena Gonzales' relatives clung to each other, remembering the way she loved music, the way she danced in the kitchen on Sundays. Each family, though scarred, now shared one truth: their voices had been heard. The legacy of the victims: Keysha, Sheila, Marilee, Rena. 4 names etched into the record of justice, but more importantly, 4 lives that mattered. They were more than headlines. More than statistics. They were women with dreams, with laughter, with families who loved them. And though Flowers tried to silence them, he failed. Because today, their stories are louder than his crimes. The case of Norman Flowers is more than a courtroom story. It's a reminder of resilience, of mothers who never stopped fighting, of detectives who never closed the file, of DNA science that gave the voiceless their voices back. And it's a warning, too, that monsters can walk in daylight, can smile at neighbors, can hide in plain sight. But in the end, they cannot escape forever. Flowers is serving 3 life sentences at High Desert State Prison for the 2005 murders of Sheila Quarles, Marilee Coote, and Rena Gonzales. As the families lit candles on the anniversaries of their loved ones' deaths, they no longer carried the same unanswered questions. The questions had been answered, the truth had been told, and the monster was gone. What remained was love. Love for Keysha, love for Sheila, love for Marilee, love for Rena. And love is stronger than hate, stronger than fear, stronger than Norman Flowers ever was. If this story moved you, don't let it fade into silence. Like, share, and subscribe, because these stories matter. Justice matters. And together we can make sure that the names of victims, not killers, live on.